My husband died and left me only an old key to a shed. The children laughed. We got all the inheritance. I searched for that shed for 2 years. When I finally found and opened it, I couldn't believe my eyes. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Thomas always said that the best things in life were the ones that took time to understand. He used to say it while fixing the porch railing on Saturday mornings, coffee balanced on the step beside him, sawdust on his flannel shirt. He'd say it the way some men recite scripture, quietly, without needing an audience. I'd watch him from the kitchen window and think, this is it. This is the whole thing. 41 years of marriage, and I never once stopped meaning it. We met in Dayton, Ohio in the fall of 1979. I was 22 and working at the county clerk's office. Thomas Elroy Hartwell walked in to file a property deed and spent 40 minutes asking me questions that had nothing to do with the paperwork. By the time he left, he'd written his phone number on the back of a carbon copy form. I still have it somewhere. Or I did, before everything changed. We built a life the way most people do, slowly, imperfectly, with more love than money in the early years. Thomas worked in property management. I raised our 3 children, Derek, Susan, and the youngest, Paul. We moved from Dayton to a small house outside Columbus when the kids were in elementary school, and we stayed there for 30 years. We weren't wealthy. We were stable. There's a difference, and I didn't fully understand how much that difference mattered until Thomas got sick. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of 2019. By November, he was gone. I won't spend long on the grief. Anyone who has lost a spouse of 40 years knows that there are no words adequate to the task, and I've learned not to perform pain for people who are simply curious. What I will say is this: I was not prepared, not for the loss of him, and not for what came after. The will was read 3 weeks after the funeral, in a conference room at the office of Thomas's attorney, Gerald Finch, a quiet man in his 60s who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with what he was about to do. Derek, Susan, and Paul sat across from me in their dark clothes, still wearing the particular expression that adult children wear when they are calculating rather than grieving. Gerald read the document carefully. The house, which we had finally paid off in 2014, went to the children to be sold and split 3 ways. The savings account, modest as it was, went to the children. The truck went to Derek. The workshop tools went to Paul. Various small items were distributed with the kind of precision that told me Thomas had spent a long time on this document, which made what came next even harder to understand. To my wife, Margaret Ann Hartwell, I leave the key. She will know what it opens. I trust her to find it. Gerald slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was an old brass key, tarnished and plain, attached to a piece of leather cord. No address, no explanation, no map. I looked up from the envelope. My children were already looking at each other. Derek spoke first. He was 53 years old and had his father's jaw and none of his father's patience. "That's it?" he said. "That's what he left you?" "Apparently," I said. Susan, who had always been the one to dress cruelty in the language of concern, leaned forward and touched my hand. "Mom, maybe he meant it symbolically. You know how Dad was. He loved his little gestures." "It's a real key," I said. I could feel the weight of it. The teeth were worn but deliberate. Paul laughed. He was the youngest and had spent most of his adult life waiting for windfalls that never materialized. "Well," he said, "I guess we got the inheritance and you got the mystery." He said it like it was a joke. They all smiled. I put the key in my coat pocket and said nothing. The drive home was 40 minutes. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The house that had been my home for 30 years would need to be listed within 60 days per the terms of the will. I had 60 days to pack a life. I held the key in my palm in the dark of the front hallway and tried to remember. Had Thomas ever mentioned a shed, a storage unit, a second property? Had I missed something? Some conversation, some passing reference that I'd let slide past me the way you let slide the small things in a long marriage, assuming there will always be more time? She will know what it opens. But I didn't know. Not yet. What I did know, standing there in the hallway of the house I was about to lose, was this. Thomas Hartwell had never done anything without a reason, not once in 41 years, and I was going to find out what that key opened if it took me the rest of my life. The house sold in 44 days. Derek handled the listing. He'd gotten his real estate license years ago, let it lapse, renewed it, and now used it selectively, mostly for situations like this, where the commission stayed in the family. I didn't fight it. I was still moving through those early weeks in the particular fog that follows a death compounded by displacement, and fighting required an energy I hadn't yet located. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Westerville, a suburb north of Columbus, at the end of January 2020. The apartment was clean and small and smelled faintly of the previous tenant's laundry detergent. I put Thomas's photograph on the windowsill and the key on the kitchen counter where I could see it while I made coffee. I made a lot of coffee that winter. The money situation was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable. I had my Social Security, which I'd begun drawing at 62, a decision I'd made with Thomas, in better times, for reasons that no longer applied. I had a small pension from the 20 years I'd spent working for the county. I had the contents of a joint checking account that, after the funeral expenses, contained just under $4,000. That was the whole of it. Everything else had gone to the children, as the will specified. I did not contest the will. I want to be clear about that, because people often assume I should have, that a competent attorney could have found grounds for challenge, that Thomas's intentions were unclear, that I was taken advantage of. Maybe all of that is true, but at that point, in those first weeks, I was not yet thinking about fighting. I was thinking about surviving. It was Susan who called in February, ostensibly to check on me. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. She asked whether I was eating well, whether I had friends nearby, whether I'd considered a community, by which she meant a senior living facility, though she didn't say so directly. She had a gift for suggesting things without saying them. At the end of the call, she mentioned, gently, that they'd found some of Thomas's old papers while clearing out the workshop, and that if there was anything personal I wanted, I should let Derek know before they go through everything. I thanked her and hung up and sat very still for a moment. Before they go through everything. That was when something shifted. Not dramatically. I am not a dramatic person. But something that had been soft and grieving in me became, quietly, harder. I took the key off the counter and held it. Thomas had been in property management for 30 years. He had bought, sold, managed, and transferred more parcels of land than I could count. It was possible, more than possible, that somewhere in those decades of transactions, he had held onto something, a small parcel, a storage structure, something he'd kept quiet not out of deception, but out of the particular privacy that some men of his generation maintained around financial matters, the belief that worry was a burden you didn't share until you had a solution to offer alongside it. She will know what it opens. He believed I would know, which meant he believed I had the means to find out. I got out a legal pad and wrote down everything I could remember. Every property he'd mentioned, every county he'd done work in, every name of a seller or buyer that had come up at the dinner table over the years. I filled 2 pages. Then I made a list of what I needed: access to property records, deed histories, Thomas's old work files if I could get them, and someone who understood how to read county archives. I was 71 years old. I had never conducted a property search in my life, and my children were already moving through Thomas's papers without me. I gave myself a week to feel sorry for myself. 1 week, I was deliberate about it. I cried. I slept badly. I ate cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row and watched old movies and allowed myself the full weight of how unfair it all was. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of February, I got dressed, put the key in my purse, and drove to the Franklin County Recorder's office. I told the woman at the desk that I was looking for any property ever recorded under the name Thomas Elroy Hartwell. She looked at me with the mild curiosity of someone who has seen many determined elderly women walk through that door, and she pointed me toward the public access terminals. I sat down and I began. The Franklin County records went back decades, and Thomas's name appeared in them more than I expected. There were the obvious entries: our house on Clearwater Drive, a rental duplex he'd managed briefly in the 90s, several transactions where he appeared as the agent of record rather than the owner. I printed what I could and wrote down the rest in a small notebook I'd bought at the drugstore on the way over. The woman at the desk, her name tag said Rosalind, glanced over once and offered to show me how to narrow the search by date range. I accepted the help gratefully. I spent 3 hours at those terminals. By the time I left, I had a clearer picture of Thomas's professional history, but no answer to my question. Nothing in Franklin County was currently recorded in his name that I didn't already know about. I went home and made soup and spread my notes across the kitchen table. If not Franklin County, then where? Thomas had worked across central Ohio for most of his career. I thought about the counties that bordered ours: Delaware, Licking, Fairfield, Pickaway, Madison. He'd mentioned clients in several of them over the years. I tried to remember more specific details. There had been a period in the early 2000s when he'd driven out toward Lancaster on Fridays. I'd assumed it was a client. I'd never asked. I began working outward, 1 county at a time. Most recorders' offices had online portals by now, varying in quality and ease of use. I taught myself to navigate them the way I'd learned every other system in my life, slowly, stubbornly, with a great deal of written notes and a refusal to be embarrassed by not knowing. I drove to the Licking County office in person when the online portal gave me errors. I called the Fairfield County Recorder and spoke with a man named Gary, who was patient with my questions. It was in the 3rd week of March, 6 weeks after I'd started, that I found it. Fairfield County, a parcel of 2.3 acres in a township called Violet, recorded in 2003 under the name Thomas E. Hartwell. The deed listed it as agricultural land with an accessory structure, no mortgage, paid in full at time of purchase, current tax status, paid through the year of his death. I sat at my kitchen table and read the record 3 times. An accessory structure. In property language, that meant a secondary building on the land, a barn, a shed, a workshop, something separate from a main dwelling. And there was no main dwelling listed, just the land and the structure. He had bought it in 2003 and told me nothing. He had paid the property taxes on it for 16 years and told me nothing, and he had left me a key. My hands were steady when I printed the record. I noticed that about myself and thought it was strange, that I felt calm at the moment that should have cracked me open. But grief had already done its cracking. What I felt now was something colder and more useful: certainty. I didn't tell the children. I want to be specific about this because it matters. The decision not to tell them was not impulsive. I thought about it for 2 days. I considered whether I had an obligation to disclose what I'd found, whether concealment was the same as deception, whether I was behaving the way Thomas would have wanted me to behave. And I concluded that I owed them nothing, not yet, because they had gone through his papers without inviting me, and because whatever Thomas had intended with that key, he had intended it for me. What I didn't know was that Susan had already noticed something. She called on a Thursday evening, the tone of the call different from the February one. Lighter on the surface, more careful underneath. She asked how I was spending my time. I said I'd been doing some research into Thomas's old business records. There was a pause, brief, but I caught it. Before she said that sounded like a nice way to feel close to him. After we hung up, I realized I'd said too much. Not much, but enough. I drove out to Violet Township on a Saturday in late March. The address on the deed led me down a county road that turned to gravel, past 2 farms and a stretch of scrub woods. And then I saw it. A metal gate, padlocked, set into a fence line. Behind it, at the end of a rutted track, a structure. Wooden, weathered, with a metal roof, no bigger than a 2-car garage. I didn't have the right to open it yet. I needed to be sure the property had passed to me, and I needed someone who could tell me whether it had. I took photographs and drove back to Westerville. The next morning, I called an estate attorney. The attorney's name was Patricia Owens, and she came recommended by a woman in my apartment building who had used her during a difficult divorce. Patricia was in her late 40s, methodical, and had the useful quality of never seeming surprised by what clients brought her. I sat across from her desk on a Monday morning with my printed deed, my notebook, and the key, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, asked 4 specific questions when I finished, and then spent several minutes reviewing the deed record I'd brought. "The asset schedule attached to the will," she said. "Does it list this parcel?" "I don't know. I only have the summary Gerald Finch read aloud." "I'll request the full document." She made a note. "Under Ohio law, property that is not specifically devised in a will and is titled solely in the decedent's name typically passes through the residuary estate. But if there's no residuary clause, or if the property was inadvertently omitted, the picture gets more complicated." She looked at me steadily. "It's also possible your husband structured this intentionally, that he understood the property would come to you through a specific legal mechanism he expected you to identify." "He was in property management for 30 years, I said. "He understood how deeds worked." She allowed herself a small nod. "Let's find out what we're dealing with before we draw conclusions. But Mrs. Hartwell, don't open anything on that property until I've reviewed the full will and confirmed your standing." It took her 11 days. The Fairfield parcel had not been listed in the will's asset schedule. Thomas's attorney, Gerald Finch, had apparently prepared the will from a list Thomas provided, and the parcel had not appeared on that list. Patricia's reading was that this was deliberate, that Thomas had intentionally excluded it from the will's distribution, knowing that as his surviving spouse and co-heir under Ohio's intestacy provisions, I would have a claim to omitted property. It was not a simple case, but it was a real one. She filed the necessary paperwork with the Fairfield County Probate Court. She also told me that I could access the property under her guidance while the matter was pending, as the presumptive heir with documented interest. I drove out to Violet Township on a Friday morning in April, 2 years and 4 months after Thomas's diagnosis. The gravel road was soft from recent rain. I parked outside the gate, took the key from my purse, and walked to the padlock. It opened on the first try. The barn was dim inside, the air cool and smelling of old wood and metal. There were shelves along 2 walls, a workbench along the back, and in the center of the space, covered with a canvas tarp, several large shapes. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Then I began to look. What Thomas had kept in that barn was not gold or cash or anything that would make sense as a dramatic discovery in a story. What it was this: 30 years of careful, private provision. There were documents in fireproof boxes, insurance policies I hadn't known existed, a life insurance policy in my name as sole beneficiary, investment account statements for a brokerage account I had never seen. There were tools of real value, a restored 1962 Ford tractor, 3 antique woodworking machines in working condition. There was a written letter in Thomas's handwriting addressed to me, tucked inside the first fireproof box. I read it standing at his workbench, and I am not going to reproduce it here because some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will say that he had known, had understood clearly, that the children would take what they could, and he had set this aside for me. For the years after, he had called it in his letter the long plan. I was still standing there, letter in hand, when I heard a car on the gravel outside. Derek and Susan arrived together. Paul was on the phone a few minutes later from Arizona, patched through on Derek's speaker. Someone, Susan, I suspected, had done more digging after my comment about Thomas's business records and had found the Fairfield County deed independently. The conversation was not quiet. Derek stood in the doorway of the barn and told me that anything on that property was part of Thomas's estate and subject to the will's distribution. He used legal-sounding language with the confidence of someone who had looked something up recently. Susan stood behind him and said she was worried I was being taken advantage of by an attorney who was stirring things up for fees. Paul, on the speaker, said they should all calm down and work this out as a family. I stood at Thomas's workbench with my hands at my sides, and I said very clearly, "My attorney is filed with the Fairfield probate court. I'd suggest you contact your own." Derek stepped forward. He did not touch me. I want to be exact about this. But he moved into the space in a way that was meant to be felt. "Mom, think about what you're doing." "I have thought about it," I said, "for 2 years." They left 20 minutes later. Derek's car threw gravel on the way out. I locked the barn, sat in my car, and shook for about 10 minutes. Then I drove home, called Patricia, and spent the following 3 days doing almost nothing. I ate. I slept. I watched the birds at the feeder outside my apartment window. I had earned 3 days. On the 4th morning, I made proper breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee in the good mug Thomas had bought me at a craft fair in Granville years ago. And I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook and made a list of what I knew. I knew that the barn existed and that I had found it. I knew that it contained a life insurance policy naming me as sole beneficiary, investment accounts in Thomas's name that would need to be probated, and physical assets of real monetary value. I knew that my children had known nothing about any of it until I led them, inadvertently, to the deed. And I knew that Patricia Owens was good at her job and was already several steps ahead of whatever Derek had found on the internet. What I had not yet built was the human architecture around me, the people who would help me stay steady. Legal support was essential, but it wasn't sufficient. I had learned in those 3 days of rest that I was more alone than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. My friendships had narrowed during Thomas's illness, the way friendships do when caregiving consumes all available hours. I had let people drift. Carol McAllister had not drifted. She had simply waited. Carol and I had met at a church committee in 1994 and had been close for 15 years before distance and busyness and the usual erosion of time had moved us to Christmas cards and occasional calls. She lived in Marietta now, 2 hours southeast, recently widowed herself. I called her on a Thursday evening without knowing exactly what I intended to say. I told her everything. It took over an hour. She asked good questions and didn't offer solutions I hadn't asked for, which is the mark of a genuinely useful friend. At the end, she said, "Maggie, do you know what Tom was telling you with that key?" I said I thought I did. "He was telling you that he trusted you more than anyone else in his life," she said. "He just needed you to trust yourself the same way." I held the phone against my ear for a moment after that and didn't say anything. Sometimes a true thing lands silently. Carol drove up the following weekend and stayed for 2 nights. We talked and cooked and walked in the park near my apartment. She did not try to manage my feelings about the children or tell me to forgive or move on. She just sat with me in the reality of the situation, which was exactly what I needed. In the meantime, Derek had called. He called on a Wednesday afternoon 5 days after the confrontation at the barn. His tone was different, controlled, almost gentle. He said he'd been thinking, that everyone had said things in the heat of the moment, that he hoped we could have a conversation. He said the word conversation 3 times. He said he didn't want this to go somewhere bad for the whole family. Then he made the offer. If I walked away from the Fairfield property claim, they would give me a share of the house proceeds that had already been distributed, 20%. He said they'd already discussed it and they were all in agreement. I listened to every word. The offer was, in legal terms, meaningless. The house had been sold and distributed months ago, and any share he was offering was coming from money that had already been divided, making it a gift, not a settlement, with its own tax implications. Beyond the legal absurdity of it, it was also, structurally, an attempt to get me to surrender a legitimate claim in exchange for a fraction of what that claim was likely worth. Patricia had already estimated that between the life insurance policy, the investment accounts, and the physical assets in the barn, I was looking at something in the range of $200,000. Possibly more. Derek was offering me somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. I thanked him for the call. He waited. "So, do you want to talk about it further? We could all meet somewhere, the 4 of us." "I'll let Patricia know you reached out," I said. "If you want to have a conversation at that level, your attorney can contact her." There was a silence. "Mom," he said, and the word had a warning in it, wrapped in filial address. "Take care of yourself, Derek," I said, and I ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter and was surprised to find that my heart rate was almost normal. 2 months ago, that conversation would have undone me for days. Now it just felt like information, data about what they were willing to try, and by extension, what they were afraid of. Fear, I had learned, was only dangerous when it moved in one direction. They came on a Saturday in late May, all 3 of them. Derek and Susan in Derek's car, Paul having flown in from Arizona the night before, which told me how serious they considered the situation. I had not invited them. Susan had texted Friday evening, "We'd like to come by and talk, Mom. As a family, please." I had replied, "You can come. I can't promise we'll agree on anything." She had replied with a heart emoji, which I found difficult to interpret charitably. They arrived at 10 in the morning, which was deliberate, early enough that it didn't feel like a confrontation, early enough that I'd be at the disadvantage of a day not yet fully begun. I had been awake since 6. I made coffee for all of us and set out a plate of shortbread because I was a woman of a certain generation and certain habits, and also because behaving with basic hospitality cost me nothing and conceded them nothing. Derek began. He was composed in a way that suggested preparation. I could almost hear the rehearsal behind his words, the careful ordering of points he and Susan had worked out in Derek's car on the drive over. He said that they'd all been doing a lot of thinking, that they realized the past few months had been hard on everyone, that they missed having their mother present in their lives in an uncomplicated way. He said Thomas's death had fractured things and that they didn't want the fracture to become permanent. Susan nodded throughout and added at the right moments softer versions of what Derek said, the counter melody to his lead. She mentioned Thomas's wishes, his love for family unity, how he would have hated to see this kind of conflict. She said the phrase "for Mom's sake" twice in a context that made clear she was speaking about me as a subject rather than addressing me as a person. At one point, she reached into her bag and produced a photograph. Thomas and I at Paul's college graduation, laughing at something off camera. She placed it on the coffee table between us as though it were evidence. I looked at it. I did not pick it up. Paul, who had always been the least artful of the three, said at one point, "Mom, do you really want to spend your last years in court?" I looked at him for a moment. "I'm 71, I said, "not terminally ill." He had the grace to look briefly embarrassed. Then the register shifted. It was subtle, but I had spent 41 years attuned to the emotional temperature of a room. Derek leaned forward and said that they'd spoken with Gerald Finch, that Gerald had expressed some concerns about the way my attorney was approaching the probate filing, and that they were worried I didn't fully understand the legal risks of pursuing this. He said the words, "financial exposure and complexity and a lot of stress for someone in your position." "What position is that?" I asked. He paused. "You're alone, Mom. You don't have the same support network that—" "I have an attorney," I said. "I have a very good friend. I have my own judgment which has served me adequately for 7 decades. Susan reached over and put her hand on my arm. Her touch was warm and practiced. "We're not trying to fight you," she said, and her voice had that particular softness she deployed when she wanted to be believed. "We're trying to protect you. Dad left things complicated, and we just don't want you to get hurt chasing something that might not—" "He left me a key," I said. "He left everyone else everything else. I don't think that was complicated. I think it was quite clear." There was a silence in the room that had a different quality from the ones before it. This one had weight. Derek's composure, which had held through the first 40 minutes, began to show its seams. He said, more flatly, that if this went to court, it would cost everyone money and time, that the outcome wasn't guaranteed, that I should think about what I was doing to the family. He mentioned, almost in passing, that there were people in their social circle, friends of Thomas's, people from the old neighborhood, who didn't fully understand what was happening and might form impressions. I understood what he was suggesting without his needing to say it plainly. It was the oldest form of pressure, the threat of reputation, of story, of being the woman who made a difficult situation worse. "What I'm doing," I said, "is following my husband's instructions." "He's gone," Derek said. The softness was entirely out of his voice now. "You can honor his memory without blowing up our family over a barn in the middle of nowhere." I stood up. Not dramatically. I simply stood, which is a different thing. "I think we've said what we came to say." I appreciate that you drove out." Paul stood automatically. Susan looked at Derek. Derek looked at me for a long moment with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager who'd been told no for the first time about something he'd wanted badly. "This is a mistake," he said. "That may be," I said, "but it's mine to make." They were gone by 11:15. I washed the coffee cups, put away the shortbread, and put the photograph of Thomas and me back in the drawer where I kept it, where it had always lived, where it belonged to me and no one else. Then I stood at the kitchen window for a long while. My hands were steady. My chest was not. There was a low, cold fear moving through me, the kind that comes not from confusion but from clarity, from knowing that what you are doing is real and the opposition is real and the outcome is not guaranteed. Derek's parting words sat in the room after him like smoke. I let myself feel the fear fully, without rushing past it or explaining it away. And then I let it harden into something I could use. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in September in the Fairfield County Courthouse in Lancaster. Patricia and I drove down together the evening before and stayed at a small inn near the town square. Over dinner, she walked me through what to expect. The hearing was before a probate magistrate, not a full jury trial. It would be procedural and methodical, and it would be won or lost on documents and legal reasoning, not on sympathy or drama. Our position rested on 3 pillars: the deed's omission from the will's asset schedule, Thomas's demonstrable intent as evidenced by the letter and the key, and the life insurance policy, which was a separate instrument entirely and not subject to probate at all. It would pay directly to me as named beneficiary regardless of the hearing's outcome. "The investment accounts are the contested terrain," Patricia said, over a bowl of soup she'd barely touched. "Those were titled solely in Thomas's name, which means they're subject to the will. The argument your children's attorney will make is that the residuary clause, which reads all remaining assets, captures everything not specifically itemized, including the Fairfield parcel. And our argument? That the residuary clause must be read in context, and that Thomas's deliberate exclusion of the parcel from the asset schedule, combined with the specific instruction left to you in the letter, demonstrates clear testamentary intent to treat that property separately. We're also arguing that the 2003 deed, purchased in cash with no mortgage, using funds traceable to a private account that was never treated as marital property in any prior disclosure, represents Thomas's separate provision for you, entirely consistent with the letter's contents and his 16 years of private maintenance of that property. Will it hold? She looked at me steadily. I believe it will, but I want you to be prepared for the fact that magistrates are not always predictable, and Caldwell is not incompetent. I told her I had been preparing for unpredictability for most of my adult life. She looked at me for a moment and then picked up her soup spoon, which I took as a sign that she believed me. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the unfamiliar inn bed and listened to the quiet of a small Ohio city at midnight and thought about Thomas. I thought about him buying that land in 2003, signing the deed, paying the first year of taxes, driving out to Violet Township to unlock the gate and walk the perimeter of something he was building for me over decades. I thought about all the Friday afternoons I'd assumed were client calls. I thought about how much a person can hold without it ever showing on their face. I was up before 5. I dressed carefully. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled with tall windows that let in the flat gray light of a September morning. Derek and Susan sat at the respondents' table with their attorney, Caldwell, a younger man with an organized briefcase and the slightly too deliberate calm of someone managing his own nerves. He had brought an associate, who sat behind him taking notes. Paul had submitted a written statement. He was not present in person. I noticed Derek's jaw when he saw me come in, the small tightening that told me he had expected, perhaps even hoped, that I might not appear. I sat beside Patricia at the petitioner's table and placed my hands flat on the surface in front of me. Magistrate Harper was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a lanyard and the specific patience of someone who had heard a great many families argue about money. She ran the hearing efficiently and without ceremony. Patricia presented our case methodically. The deed recorded in 2003, the purchase price paid in full, the consistent payment of property taxes for 16 years, withdrawn from an account in Thomas's name alone, the omission of the property from the will's asset schedule, not accidental, Patricia argued, but deliberate. She submitted the letter into evidence. She did not read it aloud. She summarized its contents for the magistrate and offered the original for review, along with a photographic record of the key and the padlock it opened. Magistrate Harper read the letter. She took her time. The courtroom was very quiet while she read. I watched her eyes move across the page and thought, he wrote that. Those are his words. He is still speaking. Then she set the letter down and looked at Caldwell. Counsel, your response. Caldwell's argument was technically competent. He contended that omission was not the same as exclusion, that the residuary clause was broad enough to encompass any asset not specifically listed, and that a handwritten letter, while touching, did not constitute a legally operative instrument capable of overriding the distribution specified in the will. He was methodical and clear, and I could see that he had prepared thoroughly, and for a moment I felt the hearing's outcome as genuinely uncertain. Patricia cross-examined efficiently. She asked whether his clients had any documentation showing Thomas had intended the Fairfield property to be part of the shared estate. He said the will itself was that documentation. She asked whether the will mentioned the property by address, parcel number, or any identifying detail. He said it did not. She asked why, if the property was simply an overlooked asset, the decedent had maintained it privately for 16 years, paid taxes on it separately from all marital accounts, and directed his wife to it with a physical key delivered at the formal reading of the will. Caldwell said that the decedent's motivations were not the relevant legal question. Patricia said quietly that she disagreed, and she said it with the particular confidence of someone who knows the next document she is about to introduce will land cleanly, which it did. The beneficiary designation forms, filed with the brokerage years prior, each bearing Thomas's signature and my name. Derek, watching from the table, had the expression of a man who had been certain of the outcome and was now doing rapid, unhappy arithmetic. Susan sat very still. There was a moment, I saw it and I believe Patricia saw it, when Caldwell leaned over and said something to Derek, and Derek looked down at the table rather than at the magistrate, and Susan's hand, resting on the table, slowly closed into a fist. Magistrate Harper asked me 2 questions directly. She asked whether I had ever been informed of the Fairfield property during the marriage. I said I had not. She asked whether, given that fact, I had any explanation for why my husband had directed me to it. I said that Thomas believed in providing for the long term, and that I believed he had done exactly that, in the way he knew best, quietly, carefully, and with complete confidence that I would find what he'd left. She looked at me for a moment over her reading glasses. Then she made a note. The hearing concluded before noon. The ruling came by mail 17 days later, on a Tuesday in early October. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and the crossword from Sunday's paper, which I'd left unfinished because 6 across had been resisting me. I saw the Fairfield County return address on the envelope and set everything else aside. I opened it carefully, the way I open things that matter, and read the 3-page document twice, slowly, before I allowed myself to fully understand what it said. Magistrate Harper had ruled in my favor. Her reasoning was methodical and grounded in 2 main findings. First, the Fairfield parcel had been deliberately omitted from the will's asset schedule, and the evidence, the private account used for purchase, the 16 years of separately maintained tax payments, the physical key delivered to Margaret Hartwell at the will reading, and the accompanying letter, supported a finding of specific testamentary intent to transfer the property outside the will's distribution mechanism. She noted specifically that the precision of Thomas's arrangement, the private account, the beneficiary designations, the letter, the key, reflected the deliberate planning of a man with 30 years of professional experience in property transactions, not the oversight of one. Second, Ohio's provisions for omitted property in cases where the decedent's intent was demonstrable entitled the surviving spouse to the omitted asset. The Fairfield property, with its 2.3 acres and all structures thereon, was awarded to me. I set the document down and picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while I was reading. I drank it anyway and looked out the window at the parking lot of my apartment complex and thought about a Tuesday morning in February 2020 when I had driven to the Franklin County Recorder's office with a legal pad and a brass key and no idea what I was going to find. 20 months, 2 counties, 3 attorneys between us, 1 probate magistrate with reading glasses on a lanyard who had read my dead husband's letter in a quiet courtroom and taken her time with it. I called Patricia from the kitchen table. She had already received her copy. "Congratulations, Margaret," she said. It was the first time she'd called me by my first name. The life insurance policy had already been processing separately, outside the probate entirely. Because I was the named beneficiary on a private policy, it had never been subject to the will's distribution in any form. Patricia had filed the claim in the first weeks of our work together. The payment, $165,000, arrived in my bank account by direct deposit 3 weeks after the hearing, while we were still waiting for the written ruling. I had looked at that deposit notification on my phone while sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store and had to sit there for several minutes before I felt composed enough to go inside. The investment accounts resolved within 60 days of the ruling. Thomas had filed beneficiary designation forms with the brokerage, a standard instrument that operates entirely outside the will, transferring assets directly to the named beneficiary upon the account holder's death. Patricia had located the filing in the brokerage's records during discovery. The accounts, totaling just under $48,000, transferred to me by beneficiary designation, cleanly and without further contest. By the time the last transfer cleared in November, I had received or been legally awarded approximately $220,000 in assets that my children had not known existed until I found them, and that they had spent 8 months in considerable legal fees trying to prevent me from claiming. Derek's attorney sent a letter 15 days after the ruling, stating that his clients were considering an appeal on the grounds that the magistrate's interpretation of the residuary clause was an error of law. I read that letter 3 times, looking for something behind the language, some new angle I hadn't anticipated. I brought it to Patricia the next morning. She was not concerned. She wrote a response that was measured and thorough and, I sensed, slightly enjoyable for her to compose. She outlined the legal standard for overturning a probate magistrate's ruling in Ohio, which was narrow and required demonstrating a clear legal error rather than simply a disagreement with the outcome. She noted that the beneficiary designation instruments, the life insurance and the investment accounts, together representing the substantial majority of what I'd received, were entirely outside the scope of any appeal, as they had never been part of the probate proceeding at all. They were done. Untouchable. She further noted, in precise and courteous language, that the magistrate's reasoning was well grounded in Ohio precedent, and that pursuing an appeal would require a significant financial commitment from her clients for what she assessed as a very low probability of a different outcome. She suggested they consider their position carefully. 3 weeks later, Caldwell's office notified Patricia that his clients would not be pursuing further action. It was a single paragraph. No explanation, no concession, no final word. I found out on a Thursday afternoon sitting in Patricia's office with a cup of bad coffee from the machine in her hallway. She told me plainly, the way she told me everything. The case was concluded. Everything that was mine was mine. I looked at the window behind her desk, which faced a parking garage. Not a particularly inspiring view, but I had come to associate it with good news. And I thought about Thomas driving that county road to Violet Township, arriving at his gate, unlocking his barn, working in the quiet of it, building something he intended for me, patient as a man who believes in the long term always is. "Patricia," I said, "what do I do now?" She allowed herself a small smile, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. "Whatever you'd like." I took the key out of my purse. I had carried it for nearly 2 years. Through the apartment move, the county records offices, the drive to Violet Township, the morning in the barn, the September hearing, all of it. The leather cord had softened with handling. The brass was warm from my pocket. I placed it on her desk between us. "My husband trusted me to find this," I said. 2 years, 2 counties, 3 children who told me to give up. I paused. "I'd like to thank you for helping me finish what he started." Patricia picked up the key and looked at it for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between professional satisfaction and something more personal. Then she set it back in front of me. "It was your work," she said. "I just knew which doors to knock on." I took the key back. I keep it on my windowsill now, next to Thomas's photograph, where I can see it every morning. It is the most important thing I own. I sold the Fairfield land in the spring. A 2.3-acre parcel an hour from my apartment made little practical sense for a woman living alone, and I had come to understand that Thomas was not sentimental about objects. He was sentimental about provision, about outcomes, about the long view. The land sold to a neighboring farmer for $41,000. The Ford tractor, the 1962, fully restored, I donated to an agricultural museum in Lancaster, where a volunteer told me it was in exceptional condition and would be displayed. Thomas had always taken care of his things. It was good that someone would know that about him. I moved in the fall to a small house in Delaware, Ohio, on a quiet street with old oak trees and neighbors who waved but didn't intrude. The house had a porch and a proper yard and enough space for the kitchen garden I'd been wanting for years. It was the first home I had chosen entirely for myself, without consulting a husband, without accommodating children, without calculating what would be easiest for everyone else. The decision took me one afternoon. I knew it the moment I stood in the backyard and saw where the light fell. I painted the front door red. Thomas had always gently suggested blue. The red was exactly right. Carol came to see the house in October, and we spent the weekend planting bulbs and making soup. She was talking about relocating closer to Columbus, and I told her I'd have a proper room ready whenever she needed it. We've had that conversation several times since, each time more concrete. I think she's genuinely coming. The money I managed carefully. A portion went into a low-risk investment account. A portion paid for the Delaware house outright. A small amount I set aside for experiences I had postponed for years. I went to Portland, Oregon in the spring to see the rose gardens, something I'd wanted since 1987. I went with a woman from my church who'd never been on an airplane, and her delight at the whole thing made the trip twice as good. I did not give any of the money to my children. With Paul, there is something still alive, if fragile. He called twice in the year following the ruling. We talked about his children, my garden, small things. He didn't apologize directly, but there was genuine care in his voice that I chose to receive rather than interrogate. With Derek, I have accepted the damage is likely permanent. What he did was not simply contest a legal claim. He looked at his mother in the first year of her widowhood and decided she could be managed. He was wrong, and I don't think he has forgiven me for proving it. Susan I hear about through the family network. Her marriage had already been strained before Thomas's death. The months of legal dispute and the outcome did not help. I learned this without satisfaction, only with the quiet recognition that Susan had always directed her discomfort outward, and the people closest to her had always paid for it. What I feel when I think about all three of them is not triumph. My goal was never their diminishment. My goal was a red door in a kitchen garden and the dignity of having followed my husband's instructions to their end. What I feel is peace. And some mornings, standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the October light come through the oak trees, gold, unhurried, indifferent to everything beneath it, I feel something it takes me a moment to name: gratitude, plain and full and without condition. Thomas knew me. He trusted me. And I found the door. Thomas taught me something I didn't fully learn until after he was gone, that the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift, whether they mean to or not. They handed me their doubt, and I built a foundation out of it. If your name is on the key, you find the door. You don't wait for permission. You don't let grief or fear or someone else's greed convince you that what's yours isn't worth the searching. That barn was always mine. It just needed 2 years and a little stubbornness. What would you have done in my place? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment,